Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to come today. I've been asked to talk about caffeine and cognitive functioning. And what do we mean by cognitive functioning? We mean those higher order mental activities that really make us human, our ability to reason, abstract, to memorize, learn, to use language, to be able to visualize spatial relationships. And with regard to cognitive functioning in general, there is a belief, a long-held belief, that it's natural that this should decline with age. And in fact, whenever you see an actor representing an elderly person in the theatre, it's usually someone who's quite forgetful. But with increasing technology, we've been able to identify a lot of underlying pathologies, and bit by bit we've realised that a large part of what we considered to be inevitable loss of cognitive functioning with age is in fact reversible. That we've been able to do this by better cardiovascular health, by realising that many of the medications that are used by elderly people actually have effects which mimic early dementia even. That one of the dilemmas perhaps now is that there is still a lot of cognitive decline which we can't explain, and there is still that really catastrophic form of cognitive decline, which are the dementias and above all Alzheimer's disease. And it's perhaps one of the big dilemmas of science today is that while we're able to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, we care for people better, we can prolong their lives, but we have no way of intervening with the disease process. We cannot prevent it. And we've actually, by our technology, we now have increased the number of cases in the population at any one time. And this is really where epidemiologists like myself and Carlo come in that what we can do is looking at the population who are getting sick and those who are not getting sick to identify those genetic, biological, and environmental risk factors which seem to be increasing certain people's tendency to develop these disorders or to have cognitive decline, and those which seem to facilitate it. That this is fairly important because in the history of medicine it's often been the case that we've been able to reduce actually the incidence or the number of new cases of a disease, or push back the onset of a disease by manipulating these risk factors, even though we don't understand the disease itself. And I think an example of this would be for the cholera epidemics for example, in the UK, that epidemiologists found that by getting people to clean up the water supply, they could greatly reduce the number of cases, but they had little knowledge of cholera. And so this is where we can step in with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. We know that there are many factors we've identified over the last decades which can actually push back the onset of cognitive decline in the elderly, and in particular Alzheimer's disease. And what we want to look at is how we might use these factors in a preventive way, or at least stalling the onset of some of these problems while we are waiting for some efficient drug-modifying solution. Now, in Montpellier, I directed for the last 15 years, is a large population study of around over 3,000 people. We've studied for the last 15 years. They're over 65. They represent fairly well the city of Montpellier. We followed them with everything imaginable. We have their genes, we have the biological samples, we have psychiatric examinations, imaging, pretty much anything you can think of. And one of the first exercises that I'm pointing to here is that I had a look at all of the factors we know which might modify the onset of cognitive decline and dementia. And we looked to see of all of these which were the most significant. And certain of them stood out, particularly diabetes, depression, diet, stroke, and ApoE4, which is the main genetic vulnerability factor. And what's actually quite interesting is that if we calculate a thing called population attributable fraction, now what this means is we're looking at how many cases would be able to reduce over the next, in this case, 10 years, if we were completely to remove this risk factor. So if there was no more diabetes, depression, better diet, and no stroke, we would decrease the number of cases by nearly a quarter. And this is far more than if we were able to completely eradicate the main genetic factor. So diet is in there as really an important potentially modifiable factor. And what is really an international feature of all these diets is, of course, coffee and tea consumption. In particular, coffee is of particular interest to us now because while before we always thought of coffee as a psychostimulant, certainly it's something we've all used to pick ourselves up intellectually, that the tiramisu, the Italian dessert, which literally means pick me up, it's based on coffee. But we've always considered it to be as a sort of a temporary solution, it'll just pick me up for the moment. But then findings around 15, 20 years ago on colleagues who were working with mice populations made us think a little bit more differently, and that we found that mice that had been, transgenic mice that were simulating Alzheimer's disease and were fed on caffeine were actually found to have far less of what we call the beta amyloid plaques. That is, they're little plaques made of amyloid which are toxic and accumulate in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, and are also highly present in people who have rapid cognitive decline, even though they might not develop Alzheimer's disease. There were a number of small studies after that, some retrospective studies looking at, do people with Alzheimer's disease drink less coffee? Yes, they do, but they might not remember as well either. There have been studies that have followed people up longitudinally, so we can have the temporal relationship, we can look at the fact that, yes, the coffee consumption is becoming before the cognitive decline. But the trouble with these studies also is that they haven't taken into account what we call confusion factors or confounding factors. That is to say, people who are drinking coffee, for example, might be brighter, they might have more social contact, more intellectual ability, they might be taking less of the drugs which compromise our cognitive functioning. And all of these would in fact give us a picture of caffeine as having an influence, but in fact it's another factor behind. So really going back to this study that I told you about in our centre of 3,000 people, there are two other studies like it carried out in the west and the north of France, and together we have a population of over 10,000 people followed for 15 years where we can examine all of these factors. In particular, we can take a detailed look at the coffee and tea consumption. So we measured caffeine consumption by looking at one dose is preferably one espresso coffee, and we counted for granulated coffee as half a dose. And what did we come up with? Well, it's probably the biggest population study that's been carried out to date. And when we looked at people over 5 years, we found there was a really strong association between coffee consumption, particularly at 3 cups and more, and cognitive decline over the next 5 years. We had a closer look at this and we found it was actually women only. I'm afraid it wasn't having any effect on the men, but the women were really benefiting from this coffee consumption. And there's a dose effect. Women who are having less than 1 milligram of caffeine a day are really not having any effect. There's about a 20% improvement in decline for women who are having 1 to 2, but the women who are having 3 milligrams and more per day were actually showing up to 50% improvement. And what's more, as they got older, this effect seemed to become stronger. So do we stop there and say, well, it looks as though caffeine is preventing cognitive decline in women? I think we have to look again. In our study, we couldn't see it preventing Alzheimer's disease. We probably need to look a lot longer to see if, in fact, in the longer term, there are less cases. But I think the more important question, and I think, Carla will probably take this up as well, in epidemiology, we're showing associations, but are we really showing cause and effect? That, having white hair is also associated with Alzheimer's disease, but it's not the cause. It's age is probably the intermediary factor. And in epidemiology, when we're looking to establish causality, we look at 4 features in particular. The strength. Is there a strong relationship? Yes, in this case there is. It's a strong relationship for women. Temporality. Is the cause preceding the effect? Yes, we had a longitudinal study. We could prove that it was coffee consumption at baseline which was driving the loss of decline later on. There's a biological gradient. Yes, there is. In women, the more coffee we're drinking, we see the greater the protective effect. But we're left with the last one, which is our biological hypothesis, and I think we really need to have to prove this to be sure. Now, the principle... I'm sorry, this is a bit messy. But the principal hypothesis that was underlying this in the beginning was that in the mice that had Alzheimer's disease, we found two things. We found they had less amyloid plaques, and they had more of a substance called adenosine, which we believe probably has a role in clearing out amyloid from the brain. We had a look in our population. We could only look at plasma amyloid, but we did find that there was a lowered amount of amyloid in the brains of the women who were taking coffee. But it was a really small effect. It didn't seem enough to be able to explain the difference we were seeing. We also saw that the women who were drinking more coffee were having less vascular lesions in the brain. But it's still not enough to be convincing, so we looked at alternative hypotheses. Perhaps, as you see, perhaps what's happening is coffee or caffeine is reducing diabetes or insulin resistance, and that in return is what is reducing cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. It could be that drinking coffee makes people less depressed, and that depression is linked to cognitive impairment. Depression is also linked afterwards to diabetes as well. So we tested all of this in our paper, and we found that these pathways were not the reason. And so we're left with the amyloid hypothesis, which is really not very clear at the moment. It's not, from our type of study, a big population study, it's not coming out as an outstanding causal pathway. And when I was speaking in Costa Rica to a similar group of people, that one of the scientists from ILI came up to me afterwards and said, "You seem to have overlooked a rather important fact, which is that the coffee bean is probably one of the richest sources of estrogen." And this suddenly started to make far more sense, and it's the hypothesis which I think probably should be looked at more closely. Is it that women who are after menopause, who are not taking hormonal replacement therapy, are these women benefiting from coffee intake? And it's a form of pretty benign hormonal treatment. There's a little bit of evidence for this in that there's a relationship between Parkinson's disease and higher coffee consumption. Women and men who are drinking more coffee, in the same, again, it's more than 3 doses a day, actually have less Parkinson's disease. But in hormonal replacement therapy women, this isn't the case. It's almost as though it's having no effect because the hormonal replacement therapy is doing the same thing. So where does all that lead us? As I said, I think that leads us to a conclusion that there is a really strong effect of certainly coffee consumption in women in reducing cognitive decline over time. We're still not sure whether in the long run this is going to reduce the number of cases of Alzheimer's disease. That it seems highly likely that there is a cause and effect relationship, but we can't say for sure until we really have established the biological pathway, and I think for this we need longitudinal studies and perhaps randomised control studies with people who are blind but going on different doses of coffee and following them across time, taking into account steroids, that is estrogen level in the blood, which we don't have. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you and await questions.